Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of the course. Today, we will be talking about the good offices of the Secretary General of the United Nations. This topic, relates to an important aspect of the work of the UN in the area of peace and security. It's a critical tool that the UN has at its disposal in dealing with peaceful resolution and prevention of conflict. So we will touch on issues like the peaceful resolution of conflicts under the Charter of the UN, that is Chapter 6 of the Charter of the United Nations. We will talk about the meaning of good offices in the UN context. We will talk about the authority from which the Secretary General derives the source of the authority for the Secretary General in his good offices role. We will talk about how good offices are conducted, and we will look at a couple of examples of mediation as case studies very briefly. And then we will have this will be about 20 minutes on my part, and then there will be a 10-minute question and answer session when you can and you can post your questions through the Q&A function on your screen. So I'll start with some general remarks about peace in the normative framework of the UN and juxtapose it a little bit with today's challenging geopolitical context. So preventing and resolving conflicts is really at the heart of what the UN is. It's raison d'etre. It was an organization established to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, as the Charter says. And when states become members of the United Nations, they make a commitment to peace by virtue of becoming members of the United Nations. So Article 4 of the Charter says that the membership is open to all peace-loving states that accept the obligations contained in the United Nations Charter. So there is that formal commitment that states make when joining the United Nations. But of course, this is, the formality. It's easier said than done. There's all sorts of factors, some big, some small, that really make ensuring and sustaining peace a difficult task. So in short, nobody declares that they're a champion of war and conflict. Everyone favors peace, at least in principle. But peace, as we know, remains elusive in many parts of the world. And that's despite the fact that another world war has been avoided since the establishment of the United Nations in 1945, which in itself is no small achievement. Similarly, there is a universal agreement that it is best to resolve disputes before they escalate into armed conflict. And that's the self-evident mantra that prevention is better than cure. But in reality, the world remains deeply challenged in acting preventively. And we can discuss why that is the case during the Q&A session, if you like. Now, contrast this global consensus around peace, multilateralism, international cooperation with the reality of the world. Any student of international relations and any really keen observer of what's going on around the world today and watching the news is very much aware of the tense geopolitical context that prevails today. The current war in Ukraine is the clearest manifestation of this strain in the international order, and that impacts the UN, of course. So this session is not about the conflict in Ukraine, but I mention it to underline the challenges that the UN system is facing in the current context of highly polarized and tense relations amongst the major powers. In addition to the Ukraine war, we have to be mindful also of the growing tensions in Asia, including the Korean Peninsula, the China-Taiwan situation, and you also have, equally relevant challenges of long-standing or more recent conflicts in the Middle East and in Africa, some of which are increasingly becoming arenas for big power rivalry and competition. So this has led to a high degree of polarization and paralysis in the Security Council itself. So that is the context we are in. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are bright spots, and there are moments when states cooperate and work together and work through the UN to address peace and security challenges around the world. So let's now talk about the UN and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. So as I said earlier, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter is focused on the peaceful resolution of conflicts. It requires member states to settle their disputes by peaceful means, and it lists a number of means for resolving disputes peacefully: negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, etc., etc. So when signing the Charter of the UN, member states are obligated to observe these obligations that they have as member states. And that's in Article 33(1) of the Charter. Now, the primary responsibility, as you know, for the maintenance of international peace and security rests with the Security Council, which has 15 members, 5 of whom are permanent and wield the famous veto power. So that's the body that makes the decisions in relation for the UN in relation to situations it considers to be threats to international peace and security. It's the decision-making body. But obviously, it is not feasible from the political or practical point of view for the Security Council as a body of 15 member states who often have divergent interests and priorities to conduct active diplomacy on a day-to-day basis and to facilitate the prevention and resolution of conflicts. And that role is therefore really given to the Secretary General. Somebody has to be the face of the UN and act on behalf of the UN. And so the Secretary General really is the agent who is responsible for implementing the decisions of the Security Council. And of course, member states themselves have obligations. But acting as the diplomat of the UN, it's very often the Secretary General and the Secretariat that supports him. Sometimes such political mandates are given by the General Assembly also, but on rare occasions. So this brings us to the heart of the subject of our discussion, good offices of the Secretary General. What do we mean by good offices? Good offices, kind of an arcane term, but at least in the UN context, is a kind of catch-all term that encompasses all sorts of diverse diplomatic and political engagements and activities by the Secretary General and or his representatives to help prevent the occurrence or resumption of conflicts, B, resolve ongoing conflicts, and C, mitigate or address the consequences of a conflict. So prevent, resolve, and mitigate consequences. And so therefore, the good offices of the Secretary General serves different purposes, and it can also take different forms. Now, these good offices activities by the Secretary General and his support fall under two broad categories, and we can refer to these as preventive diplomacy and peacemaking. These are, clear terms that explain their meaning, but in the Agenda for Peace of 1992, then Secretary General Boutros Ghali defined preventive diplomacy as diplomatic action taken at the earliest possible stage to prevent disputes from arising between parties, to prevent existing disputes from escalating into conflicts, and to limit the spread of the latter when they occur. So it's prevention. Then, by contrast, peacemaking, it relates to measures that are taken to address conflicts that are already in progress. And it usually involves diplomatic action to bring hostile parties to the negotiating table and eventually to a settlement or an agreement. So those are the purposes of good offices. That's what you employ the Secretary General's good offices for. Let's talk about the forms or the modalities for good offices implementation. As we said, good offices can take many different forms, but let's mention two of the most common ones. And so this is about the how. The first is facilitation. This usually is a relatively light form of third-party engagement, and it can mean many different things. It could mean quiet diplomacy. It could mean providing technical assistance or expertise to support bilateral efforts by the disputing parties themselves, which means you can send a military advisor, an electoral advisor, a constitutional expert, etc., to help the negotiating process that is conducted by other parties. But it could also mean providing facilities or providing venues for meetings, and also even financial assistance for certain processes in certain circumstances. So the key distinguishing feature of facilitation is that it represents a less intrusive role than mediation, and it's more about supporting and providing impetus and being a catalytic to peace processes. Mediation is defined in the UN guidance of 2012 on mediation as, quote, a process whereby a third party assists two or more parties with their consent to prevent, manage, or resolve a conflict by helping them to develop mutually acceptable agreements. So mediation involves a more hands-on role for the third party. A mediator is expected to develop proposals for a solution, be it an interim solution, a comprehensive one, short-term, or a permanent solution, and also to bridge the gap between the positions of the parties. So we will look at the current deal on the grain exports of Ukraine as an example of an agreement of a limited scope. Obviously, mediation carries a higher political risk because as a mediator, the UN becomes an active participant in the substance of the negotiations themselves. And where does the Secretary General derive his authority to act in this manner? When you look at the Charter of the United Nations, the only article in the Charter that gives the Secretary General any political authority is Article 99, which basically says that the Secretary General can bring to the attention of the Security Council situations that he considers could be threats to international peace and security. But over the years, this term has been expanded, and therefore the Secretary General has a much more independent role than is envisaged in the Charter. But quite often, that mandate to mediate or facilitate or support the peace process is really given by the Security Council. They could specifically say, they could ask the Secretary General to provide support, to initiate discussions, dialogue, mediation, etc., to a specific conflict. And we will call that a specific mandate. But as I said, the Secretary General, by virtue of being Secretary General of the United Nations, through practice, has really developed an independent role for himself, and therefore there is an inherent or implied mandate for him to be able to initiate dialogue and consultation and mediation, but also member states or parties to a conflict can approach him to assist them in resolving a conflict. So that could be done without necessarily referring to the Security Council or getting a specific mandate from the Security Council. Now, how does this look in practice? The Secretary General can carry out his good office's responsibilities through his personal diplomacy. He is in constant contact with all kinds of actors on a day-to-day basis. And secondly, since he cannot do all of that by himself, there is institutional support from the Secretariat, and there's delegated authority given to his special envoys, special representatives, personal representatives. There are all kinds of designations in the UN system. And that includes the heads of peace operations in the field. So, and his senior staff at headquarters, heads of departments, particularly the head of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the head of the Peacekeeping Department, the Department of Peace Operations, as well as sometimes the humanitarian heads of entities in the UN can act on his behalf in the good officer's role. So let's look at a couple of cases for illustration. We'll go through these as quickly as we can. The first case I want to mention is a contemporary current one. This is the agreement, an agreement of a limited scope that was negotiated between Ukraine and Russia as the current conflict goes on. And that was facilitated and mediated through the good offices of the UN Secretary General and the leadership of the Turkey. The Secretary General did not have a specific mandate from the Security Council, but had the broad support of member states, including from members of the Security Council. And what does this deal involve? So Ukraine and Russia are two of the biggest grain exporters in the world. Russia is a main exporter of fertilizers and fertilizer inputs. Ukraine exported something like 45 million tons of grain to the global market before the outbreak of the war. Since the start of the war, the exports of grain from Ukraine, as well as food and fertilizers from Russia, have been significantly hit, and the disruption in supplies pushed prices soaring even higher than they were before and contributed to a global food crisis. So in order to address this problem as the war was continuing, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as it is called formally, was brokered by the UN and Turkey, as I said, in July 2022. And it was set up to reintroduce the flow of vital food and fertilizers into the global market. So the procedure is that vessels that will carry the grain from Ukrainian ports are inspected on their way in, for military purposes, and they are inspected on their way out to make sure that they carry only grain. Now, the other part of the deal, it's actually a set of two deals, is an agreement that would facilitate the export of Russian food and fertilizers. So overall, this initiative has succeeded in significantly bringing down global grain prices as the war continues, and ensuring that food aid to needy countries, often delivered by the World Food Programme, reaches the intended needy populations. Russia briefly suspended its participation last month due to alleged attacks against its ships in the area. It has also complained that the export of its products has been hindered. Thankfully, it has returned to the initiative and has resumed its participation, and this is proceeding well. So this has been a successful mediation effort of a limited scope, not to resolve the conflict, but to mitigate an important aspect of the consequences of the war. And this was done through the good offices of the Secretary General and the government of Turkey. The Secretary General relied on his inherent good officer's mandate. There was no specific mandate from the Security Council. He worked personally on this through his personal diplomacy, but also through his Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Secretary General of the Geneva-based United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, as it relates to the Russian part of the deal. So let's look now at another mediation process of historical value, somewhat more conventional in its nature. And this is the negotiations over East Timor in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, this was a case of negotiations mediated through the good offices of the Secretary General under a General Assembly mandate given to him in 1982. The negotiations began in 1983 and they went on until the end of the 1990s. They saw 3 Secretaries General without really any progress taking place. But finally, in 1999, the process culminated in a very important agreement that paved the way for East Timor's independence. Today, it's called Timor-Leste. So the important aspect I want to mention here is that although the mandate for the Secretary General derived from a General Assembly resolution, at the time, Indonesia did not recognize the successive resolutions of the General Assembly on the question of East Timor. So it agreed to the negotiations and the good offices of the Secretary General basically on the inherent mandate that he has and not on the basis of the General Assembly resolution. So that's an important nuance that can help find ways around these difficulties in processes. So the issue was that East Timor was a Portuguese colony from the 16th century until 1975. In 1975, there was an aborted effort at decolonization as Portugal had a revolution of its own and was decolonizing its colonies in Africa and elsewhere. But there was disagreement amongst the Timorese, and there was a brief civil war in 1975. And in the midst of that, the neighboring country, Indonesia, invaded at the end of 1975. And then in 1976, it annexed East Timor and declared it its 27th province. The annexation was not accepted by the UN General Assembly, and the Security Council rejected it. So legally speaking, during that period, Portugal, the colonial power, remained legally the administering power, even though it did not have actual control of the territory. And Indonesia was considered the occupying power. So the negotiations were taking place between Indonesia and Portugal through the Secretary General. And so that mandate was given to him in a 1982 resolution in the General Assembly. The negotiations began in 1983. They went on for 15 years until 1998. And in 1998, the fall of the Suharto government in Indonesia, and Indonesia was also coming under growing international pressure on the question of East Timor. That resulted in a shift in Indonesia's position. Indonesia offered autonomy for East Timor. And then in January 1999, the new president of Indonesia went even further and offered the option to the East Timorese of separating or parting ways with Indonesia if they rejected the autonomy offer. So for that purpose, in May 1999, an agreement was signed in New York through the United Nations for holding a referendum in East Timor for the Timorese people to decide their future. The referendum took place under very difficult conditions in August 1999, organized by the UN, and the result was over 98% of the population chose independence. There was a brief period of violence. A multinational force led by Indonesia stabilized the situation, and then an UN interim administration ran the country until 2002, when a new elected government of East Timorese took over. So in the interest of time, let me stop here, and we can now perhaps entertain some questions and answers. I see one question here. So the Citizens of Global Solutions, CGS organization, is advocating for a united federation of nations. They envision a federal government of all mankind that unites nations and citizens of the world under a constitution built on the principles followed by the United States and other nations. Do you believe a united federation of nations of federal world government is possible? Do you believe it would lead to an increase in world peace? Well, this is a broader question than the issue of good offices, but you know, these aspirations are expressed from time to time by different groups. This is, in an ideal world, a more united and unified world would perhaps present greater peace and collaboration across boundaries and render boundaries and political differences less relevant. But realistically, it is a very difficult aspiration to achieve, in my opinion, if not impossible. As it is, working through the United Nations and cooperating through the system is difficult enough, and addressing existing conflicts and preventing new conflicts is proving difficult. But I think it is helpful in the sense that that aspiration pushes governments and leaders to think more globally, particularly when you think of the global challenges that we have. Most of the problems we face today are not problems that can be solved by individual governments and individual states. So the need for global cooperation is only increasing with the kind of challenges that we have. So as an aspiration, I think it could have valuable use in terms of pushing states to create a greater collaborative system in the world, and also respecting the commitments they make towards global cooperation. There's also a question about the strengths and weaknesses of the UN's work in the mediation and resolution of conflict. So let me just touch, I had actually thought about speaking about that, but I had put it aside for now in the interest of time. So yes, there are comparative advantages for the UN. Some of these are its impartiality as a global universal organization. It has that impartial stance and its moral authority, its convening power, or give it a certain level of political leverage and moral authority. And so there's the ability to mobilize international political opinion and resources behind its preventive and good offices and peacemaking work. Unlike governments, this is a second important point, unlike governments, the UN doesn't have strategic, economic, military, or other interests around the world. So when the UN offers its good offices, the Secretary General is coming from the point of view of global cooperation and peace. There's no hidden agenda to talk about. Thirdly, the UN system is a complex system, and once there is a peace agreement, there's a lot of there's a need for all kinds of support to implement peace agreements. So after the signing of a peace agreement, implementation can involve the deployment of military observers, peacekeeping operations, post-conflict stabilization and post-conflict peace building is an enormous task. Rebuilding infrastructure, human rights issues, transitional justice, humanitarian assistance and development assistance is needed. And these are things that are available in the UN system. So when the conflicting parties are dealing with the UN's advantage is that it can be a kind of a one-stop shop for this kind of support for implementation of peace agreements. Obviously, there are weaknesses and challenges in the role of the UN in the UN's good officers' work. So one is the lack of military or economic leverage. The UN doesn't have an army, doesn't have an economy, the economic leverage that major countries have. So there's a high degree of dependence by the UN on the cooperation of other countries to support its peacemaking and prevention efforts. And quite often in very difficult situations, really the moral authority of the Secretary General, which is like the soft power of the UN, can only go so far. I mean, when you have really very difficult customers, it's not sufficient to have just that moral authority of the Secretary General and behind him the organization. And then related to this is if the Security Council is not united, the UN's and the Secretary General's influence and effectiveness can be compromised or even undermined. And so he's heavily reliant on support from particularly all member states, but particularly the Security Council. And then there is a major issue for the UN, which is that quite often governments are very reluctant to involve the UN in their domestic conflicts. And the fear is that by inviting the UN or by allowing the UN to come in, you kind of internationalize the issues, that they would come under the scrutiny of the Security Council if the issue is already not on the agenda of the Security Council. And so there's a lot of pushback and reluctance to involve the UN and the Secretary General in these efforts, but they also see the advantage, especially when conflicts reach a certain stage of stalemate, they see the advantage of turning to organizations like the UN to help resolve the conflict. So these would be some of the issues to think about. Then we have one more question here. Could you kindly evaluate on Kashmir issue between India and Pakistan? UN has been intervening for more than 70 years, but the peace missions and humanitarian work is also not able to limit the violence in the state. Yes, I think this is one of the long-standing and difficult thorny issues that have been a challenge for the India and Pakistan, but also for the global community. Now, the UN and the Secretary General have often expressed their readiness to help find a solution to the differences between the countries and the status of Kashmir as well. But there are bilateral agreements and bilateral processes that have been in place for a number of years. And as I mentioned earlier, a key aspect of good officers' work is the consent of the parties. If the parties do not agree to the involvement of the UN and to use the good offices of the Secretary General cannot impose himself unless he is mandated very specifically in a strong way by the Security Council. He cannot impose himself on parties and insist on playing a role. But he, at the same time, encourages on a very regular basis continued dialogue, continued respect for human rights, and addressing the problems of the population in the region, and finding a peaceful solution to the problem. And that's an issue that he raises quite often in discussions with the concerned parties. Thank you. So I don't see any other questions. I think we have come to the end of this session. Thank you very much, and have a good day for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.